And a good Thursday afternoon to all of you. We want to welcome you to an afternoon discussion on our social platforms on the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. Began in a federal courtroom in Manhattan last week. Day 9 opened up today. Some interesting developments today in the case. We're joined by my fellow defense attorney and local defense attorney, WPTV legal analyst, Michelle Suskauer. Michelle, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And also want to welcome in another expert, Doug Rudman, a former prosecutor locally, to kind of weigh in on this case, talk about where we have been, where we are at today, and where we are going. I want to start with today. The trial entering its 9th day. This could be the last day for the prosecution, possibly more likely tomorrow, because of an interesting development today. Everything rested at 10:30 a.m. due to a sickness with one of the lawyers. It was an interesting component. The jury was dismissed. The court went into recess, and then they'll pick up arguments and testimony tomorrow morning. Michelle, you're right by my side. We'll start with you. Is this interesting in the sense that we don't often see this happening? Is this just tomorrow the prosecution will pick up and move forward, or is there a psychological component here?
Well, first of all, we're assuming that they're going to pick up and move forward, assuming that the lawyer is fine and that there's no COVID. I mean, no one said that there, but that's why there's also so many alternates on this jury because of what's been going on with the pandemic and all of the variants. And so assuming that this goes on tomorrow, they're just going to pick up. And everyone took a breath today, and that's fine, and sort of recoup. It does sort of break the stride a little bit, but the prosecution was wrapping up. The government is wrapping up at so much faster than they thought they were going to. And since it's not going to be today, maybe tomorrow, definitely by Monday.
Yeah, they indicated, as Michelle, you just pointed out, that they should be done by the end of the week, although today's alternative could change that, might develop into Monday. Doug, I want to bring you in on the ending at 10:30 this morning. What did you think of this?
Well, I thought it's very interesting because when you see the jury having an opportunity to actually walk away, think, digest everything that's going on, and giving them that opportunity to really reflect on what the testimony was, it's very, very interesting how that worked out, and actually could work out very much to the benefit of the prosecution.
Yeah, we're going to see. It's going to be a really interesting way to kind of dissect and move forward in the case. As the prosecution wraps up, the defense picks up speed as well. Let's start back last week. Again, this is happening in a federal court. There's no cameras being allowed. So there's just details as we cover it and as the media covers it around the world. But it's an interesting case that happened in our backyard for over 2 decades. Doug, I want to start with you on the prosecution. What stood out to you over the last several days in the prosecution's testimony, the witnesses, anything interesting, anything surprising on your end as a prosecutor, a former prosecutor?
Not surprising, but actually I think rather intelligent. Miss Maxwell is actually charged with 6 counts, okay? The first 3 are enticement of a minor to engage in a illegal act, transportation of a minor, and trafficking. However, the second 3 charges are conspiracy to commit these trafficking charges. Now, what's actually really interesting about those second 3 charges are they actually bring Jeffrey Epstein in front and foremost as part of her case, because the allegations are she conspired with Mr. Epstein to create these crimes. And but for Miss Maxwell, Mr. Epstein would not have had the opportunity to these underage girls, to these underage people, in order to engage in sex acts. And those conspiracy allegations actually carry a much larger maximum penalty than the first 3 counts that she's facing.
Interesting points that you brought up. I know there were a number of witnesses that were brought up. We heard from some of the victims, the testimony, and then we heard from some of the people who were a part of this network, or alleged network, so to speak, or just the empire that existed within this whole 2 decade. Did you see anything that stood out to you, Michelle, in the prosecution's case? Any witnesses that you thought were really intriguing?
Well, in terms of, look, what the defense is going to be doing is trying to poke holes in the state's case. They're trying to attack credibility. And the witnesses that sort of don't have a dog in this fight at all, like a pilot or a FedEx delivery man, they were just sort of doing their job. And so how do you poke holes in them? And what they're doing is trying to show how all the pieces came together. And so those are powerful. Those are really powerful. But you're also you have to walk a very fine line when you're a defense lawyer and when there is a victim in a case. And in this case, multiple victims. How do you cross-examine? And are you going over the line? Because you have to do your job. You have to be an effective advocate. But yet, as a defense lawyer, you have to say, look, this person has credibility issues. And that's what they were doing with the women they're women that have testified, and they're only using their first names to protect them and saying, oh, well, you were only 16, you were only 14. And you were taking drugs at the time, and you had dropped out of school, and you had a pregnancy out of wedlock and those things. And yet you have to be careful because you have a jury that's, that also has empathy, has sympathy for these women too. And so that's interesting for me, just hearing about how they're cross-examining the women.
That's interesting. Interesting point that you brought up too. And as we looked each day of this week, we saw a new witness come to the stand. I thought the pilot and the FedEx delivery person were interesting because the prosecution seemed to be just reaching out, trying to find anybody, as you said, that was sort of a bystander, any connection to this case. What was interesting, Doug, and I want to talk to you first, and Michelle, you can back me up on this in terms of the pilot. The pilot was interesting in the sense I didn't think he gave a lot. He said there wasn't a lot that he saw. He didn't, the alleged acts, women, girls, nothing to that detail. But what he did say at the end that I thought was really interesting is that he mentioned that Ghislaine Maxwell was number 2 in this empire. It was Epstein, and then it was Ghislaine Maxwell. And I thought, as a defense, and Michelle, I know you're going to allude to this and talk about this, if you're trying to disconnect Ghislaine Maxwell from this man as just maybe an employee, he made it really seem like she was a powerful employee. So was that more of a huge strike for the defense, and they've got an uphill battle? And was that interesting in your point from the prosecution standpoint that that pilot may have gave something away right there that was really intriguing?
Well, and from what I saw about the pilot's testimony, I think there are really 2 things that are very important. One of which, as a prosecutor, you want to air your dirty laundry. You didn't want the defense to call the pilots, for the pilots to say they never saw anything inappropriate on the plane. They never saw anything of young girls or anything like that. So the fact that the government got that out from their own witnesses, and they called those witnesses, very, very smart. The other part is the government is telling a story. And the story is, this is what happened with these girls, with Miss Maxwell, with Mr. Epstein. And even if you can get these witnesses to corroborate 3 out of 10 facts, the fact that these stories are overlapping and the government's able to prove their case through that was actually definitely a win for the government, and I don't think it's a step back.
Michelle, what'd you think of that?
No, I totally agree with you, Doug. I think that is very important. And again, what the defense is going to say here is that, she wasn't a major player. She wasn't a major player. Maybe she was, these women at the time, girls, may have had memories that were false memories. They have been coached, etc. They were in, but again, every single witness that that the government is doing, they're building. Exactly what Doug said earlier was, she was part of this conspiracy. She helped make this work, but for her, Jeffrey Epstein could not have done what he did alone. She was there with him. And they're showing photographs, and they're bringing in documentary evidence. This is, instructions to the girls, instructions to employees. This is what, this is how you treat Mr. Epstein. This is how you treat Miss Maxwell. The girls' interaction with Miss Maxwell, what they heard, what they saw, how she would bring them into the room, literally deliver them for Jeffrey Epstein, and then take them away. And so she was not just an employee. She was a critical piece of this conspiracy.
And it's interesting, as the prosecution likely to wrap up, who do you see coming back on the stand, Doug? Is there anyone that you think the prosecution needs to put on the stand before they close up?
No, I really feel like the prosecution really tied this all up together. One of the more interesting parts of the trial is, I believe one of the girls testified that Miss Maxwell brought out a schoolgirl uniform for her to wear. And in the FBI raid of Epstein's townhome in New York, they found very similar schoolgirl outfits up there. I think the fact that the evidence is corroborating, the physical evidence is corroborating what is being said on the stand and what the witnesses have said. I actually think that the government would be better off just resting now, give the jury an opportunity to digest, and whatever defense they're going to put on, I think the prosecution's done their job already.
And I think that's a good point. And the fact is that the women now, the girls at the time that were used by Jeffrey Epstein, that were targeted, were girls that had issues, that were not close with their families, that had dropped out of school, that may have been drug addicted, and they were solicited by teens that were a little bit older. And so there is a lot that the defense can do to attack credibility. But again, the government is going to be saying, well, look, yeah, these girls had problems. You have to concede they did. They may have been runaways. They may have been on drugs. They may have been, sexually promiscuous or even abused themselves beforehand and made accusations. But that's why they were groomed. That's why it was so easy for Miss Maxwell and Mr. Epstein to groom them to do what they wanted them to do. And so that's what the government is going to have to say. They have to concede that these girls may have had issues, may have had problems, but that's exactly why they were targeted and used.
Good segue here to move as we move from the prosecution to the defense. Again, prosecution expected to wrap up tomorrow. That could change because of the developments today, the delay in the trial today. As we move forward and look at the defense's arguments and how when they opening statements, I should say, whenever they open up at some point next week, what is the case for the defense here? We've talked about separating Ghislaine Maxwell from Jeffrey Epstein and trying to disconnect here, but how do you do that?
I think it's very challenging. I really do. And they're going to have to do everything that they can to throw Jeffrey Epstein under the bus, that he was this megalomaniac, control freak. She was under his power, and try to create some sympathy, some empathy for Miss Maxwell, that she was, again, really delving into their relationship and psychologically what she was going through, and that she was, whether she was just following orders, it was all him. Again, there's no Jeffrey Epstein to say, well, I didn't do that. It was the two of us together. And they're going to try to make the government out be, look, they're vindictive. They want someone. They're trying to hang someone here. And because they don't have Jeffrey Epstein, who was responsible, they want Miss Maxwell. And then they're going to be bringing in an expert, at least one expert, to talk about false memories, that these girls, and they have to attack their credibility. They have to attack them. That prior media interviews, money that they received from a fund, some have received millions of dollars, and that's what this is all about. This is about notoriety, fame, and money, and they were, again, you can't say that they were willing participants because they were underage and you can't legally consent. So it's going to be very tough. I think it's going to be very challenging for the defense. Yeah.
And as the defense opens up next week, Doug, what do you expect to see whatever day they actually take the stand?
Well, and a couple things that Michelle said, which is really, really interesting, is number one, these girls were picked out for a reason. They were identified for a reason. They were groomed for a reason. And I believe Miss Maxwell absolutely went out of her way to find these specific girls who would be open to making money, massaging Mr. Epstein, going in and being used and abused in this way because they had that unhealthy home life and unhealthy background. The other thing that I'm going to say is I actually think that the defense, while trying to paint Miss Maxwell as being an employee, when you have photographs coming out of her with her cleavage exposed, massaging the feet of Mr. Epstein, most of the pictures coming out of Mr. Epstein or her hugging and embracing each other, I can honestly tell you that the prosecution trying to make out Miss Maxwell of being more than an employee, and the defense is she was only an employee, I think is very much an uphill battle. And I really think it's going to be difficult for them to make their case, because how many employees do you know are massaging their employer's feet on an airplane? It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, to all our social media viewers out there, if you're on any of our platforms and would like to weigh in, we offer you the opportunity to chat with us here. We've got our legal expert, Michelle Suskauer, WPTV legal analyst, and former prosecutor Doug Rudman, talking about the Ghislaine Maxwell case. It entered day 9 today in a Manhattan federal court. It shut down operations at 10:30 this morning due to an illness with one of the lawyers, expected to resume tomorrow. Prosecution expected to wrap either tomorrow or Monday, and then the defense, of course, will kick up operations next week. Do you all expect the defense to be on the stand for a long period of time, or are they going to wrap pretty quickly? What's your gut on this, Michelle?
Well, first of all, they asked for 6 weeks. They estimated this was going to take 6 weeks. I couldn't believe that was going to take 6 weeks, and it hasn't. I think this is moving a whole lot faster. This judge is moving this case. She is no nonsense. I can't see that they're going to need more than a week to put on their defense.
Doug, what do you think?
I actually agree, and I think a week would actually be a little long, because I don't know what witnesses they would call. Miss Maxwell herself would probably be the only person who they would want to hear from. And of course, she has an absolute right not to testify in her case, and her silence can never be used against her, and the jury can't infer anything. But I think with the defense that they've put forward, they're almost going to want to hear, the jury's going to want to hear from Miss Maxwell. I just don't know how that's going to turn out. I think it's very tricky either way.
Yeah. And I agree. But a jury always wants to hear from the defendant. Okay. So in every case, and it's always a challenge to try to instruct the jury that, listen, you can't use the defendant's silence against them, but inevitably that happens all the time, whether a jury is going to admit it or not. And so in this particular case, just as Doug said, I really don't know who else they're going to call. They're going to, they've had to do extensive cross-examination. They have of these girls. But again, they're going to bring in an expert. And I think that the expert is going to be important, because they're going to talk about, look, this is why would these women come in and say something that actually did not happen? They need to give the jury something to hang their hats on, to say, this did not happen and this is why. And they need to create reasonable doubt. I just don't know if they can.
Can they create a doubt if they put Ghislaine on the stand and show sympathy and empathy? Because I feel like all throughout this, all the testimony, everything we've heard prior to this trial, you don't often hear of Ghislaine reaching out to the victims. It's been all the details on the defense side, but you don't really hear about her and the empathy and sympathy. Could that weigh in, or is it better just to keep her silent?
It really depends on what kind of a witness she makes, right?
And Michelle, I would agree with you, but here's a thing that I think the defense would really capitalize on, is if they tried to paint her as some sort of battered spouse, an individual who had also been taken in by Mr. Epstein, been manipulated by him. And as a result of that, she was somehow coerced into doing his bidding. And I really think that if we're going to see any expert witnesses, it's really going to be, I think, someone trying to paint her out to be as much a victim, as much a female victim as all the other females are, being kind of drawn in by this predator.
And I think that's probably the only way to go. And what they could hope for is something called like jury nullification, that, maybe to ask the jury, listen, yes, this, she may have participated. This is what she did. Yes, that's all true. But let me give you a reason why you need to find her not guilty. And that's hard. Juries do it. Juries do jury nullification. But they're going to need a darn good expert or Miss Maxwell to be a superstar on the stand.
Do you think she'll take the stand? Would you put her on?
I don't know. First of all, if she wants to take the stand, despite what her lawyers are recommending, she has the right to take the stand. And that has happened. I'm sure Doug's had those cases. I've had those cases like, no, don't take the stand. And then they do. And, they have a right to. I don't know what kind of a witness she's going to make. She's an intelligent, very well-educated woman. That could be the key to swaying this jury if she is. And trust me, if she's going to take the stand, they have worked with her. They have worked her. They have done sample cross-examinations over and over and over, for months. So we'll see.
Doug, what do you think?
I actually can't agree with Ms. Suskauer anymore. I mean, they've literally gone through. This is not going to be a knee-jerk decision as to whether or not to call her or not. They've literally gone over every one of the questions. And I wouldn't even be surprised if they didn't bring in some former prosecutors, some former U.S. attorneys to go through a mock cross-examination with her to prepare her for what she could be facing on the bench or on the stand. And I actually think that if she's going to be called, it's going to be very, very, very carefully prepared. And I think that's going to be seen when we see it. It's going to be rehearsed. It's going to be well stated, and she's going to stay on message.
We're discussing the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, day 9 of the trial, expected to hit day 10 tomorrow, with the prosecution resting, eventually very close to resting, and then, of course, the defense picking up steam sometime next week. In our final thoughts here, I just want to open up the floor to you both. This has been such a whirlwind case. It happened in our backyard. You guys, we've all lived here for decades. We, all the details, the victims. This wasn't just a shoplifting case. Ghislaine was on aisle 2 and a shooter came in. I mean, this was a huge case that went global. Can you wrap it up in a sense as attorneys and looking at this case and dissecting it? What do you see the impact of this case being far after we get a verdict here? And what is the lasting impression that we'll see of this case? Michelle, I'll begin with you.
It is very, very close to home because these girls are from here, most of them. High school names that we know. And, so many of us have daughters. And so, and also, we've seen Jeffrey Epstein in our courtrooms and serve time in our jails. And so all the players are very familiar to us. And I think I think that there is a need, although you can't ever have closure in a case like this, that there needs to be responsibility that's, put on Miss Maxwell that's what I think that the people are feeling for her role in this. Again, that's why I think it's going to be really critical as to what the defense is doing. But it is very personal. And the fact that, for these girls who have experienced this, who've claimed to experience this, that, they'll never get Jeffrey Epstein to really serve the rest of his life in prison because he took control and took his life. And so I think everybody it's very personal for Palm Beach County, and it's very personal, of course, for them. And that's why there's such an interest in that.
Doug, your final thoughts, sir.
Again, I agree with Ms. Suskauer. This is the Jeffrey Epstein trial that we never got to have. This is the bringing to justice of a tremendous predator that really, I think, exceeds anything that we've had so far in the history. He is prolific. And without Miss Maxwell, he would not have been able to do the amount of damage that he did. This is the justice that the victims have been waiting for. This is the culmination of years and years and years of being put down. This is the final justice that I think they're going to get. And if you can't get Jeffrey Epstein, you're going to get the person that actually allowed him to be that degree of a predator.
Want to thank Doug Rudman, former prosecutor, and my colleague alongside, Michelle Suskauer, local defense attorney and WPTV legal analyst. We appreciate all our viewers. We appreciate you both weighing in on this case. I'm sure we're going to be talking about it much more extensively in the weeks to come. Again, the Ghislaine Maxwell trial kicks up tomorrow. The prosecution expected to rest either tomorrow or Monday. The defense will kick off. We'll have full coverage on WPTV, on air, and on all our social platforms. Doug, Michelle, again, thank you very much for your time. To all our viewers, thank you for joining us today.